Today I'm going to show you the evidence for the existence of Jesus, and we first begin with the Creed. One of the earliest figures we have is Paul the Apostle, and most of us know him from his letters in the Bible in the New Testament, which occurred 20 to 30 years later after Jesus' death. But here's where things get really interesting. In 1 Corinthians, Paul isn't just giving his own thoughts in his letter, he's quoting something much older. A creed that most scholars agree dates back to just within a few years after Jesus' death, and some even argue even a few months after his death. 1 Corinthians 15 verse 3 to 8 has the creed, and it says that Jesus died for our sins, he was buried and then raised on the third day, and that he was seen by multiple eyewitnesses along with the disciples and, of course, his encounter with Paul. Now that's critical because it shows that belief in Jesus as a real historical person wasn't something that developed slowly over generations. It was already established right at the very beginning within the lifetime of the disciples and the eyewitnesses. If the creed wasn't true, then of course it would have been challenged and disproven by the disciples. So you can see there was evidence for Jesus' existence as soon as he passed away through the creed. Our next piece of evidence for the existence of Jesus is of course the four Gospels. The four Gospels consist of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and these were written within the 1st century, roughly AD 65 to 100, and they contain different perspectives of when Jesus was alive. The Gospel of Jesus Christ. These are direct witness accounts and a biography of what Jesus actually did when he was here with us on earth. Now some may argue these are just religious texts, but no, they're actually historical documents. Historians don't just dismiss ancient texts just because they're religious. Instead, they question them to verify the information. Questions such as, do these accounts come from people who are directly connected to the source? Does the account match what we know of general history, archaeology, geography, non-religious sources, etc.? And the Gospels check all of those boxes. They come from different communities, written for different audiences with different styles, different perspectives, yet they all converge on the same core message. A real man named Jesus existed, Yeshua. He took part in a public ministry. His teachings attracted followers, he performed miracles, and he was crucified under Roman authority. This matters because it means the Gospels aren't just one story repeated 4 times. They're multiple perspectives from different eyewitnesses pointing back to the same person. And in historical analysis, that kind of independent convergence is a strong indicator of truth. Now here's where it gets really interesting. The non-Christian sources. You don't have to rely on Christian texts to prove Jesus existed. We can look at the non-Christian sources. So for example, take Tacitus, a highly respected Roman historian. He wasn't a Christian. In fact, he was often critical of them, and yet he records that Christus was executed under Pontius Pilate during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius. That's a hostile, independent confirmation of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ taking place. Then you have Josephus. He was a 1st century Jewish historian, and he made reference in one of his books stating that Jesus was a wise man, a teacher, and a doer of wonderful works, and he was crucified by Pontius Pilate. Remember, Josephus was not a Christian, so again, another outside source confirming the existence of Jesus. Then we have a 1st century Roman lawyer and magistrate known as Pliny the Younger. He wrote in one of his works about Christians gathering and singing to worship Christ as their God, which tells us that very early on people weren't just talking about Jesus, they were actually worshipping him as they do today. Centurius, a Roman historian writing in the early 2nd century, mentions disturbances among the Jews in Rome linked to someone called Christus. Then there's Mara bar Serapion, a Syrian philosopher, writing to his son sometime after the 1st century. He talks about the execution of a wise king of the Jews and notes that even after his death, his teachings lived on. Remember, these are not followers. These are outsiders and even critics mentioning Jesus as part of real history. The next piece of evidence for the existence of Jesus is the transformation of the disciples. Now, after Jesus' death, his followers were afraid. They were scared, they scattered, and they hid because they were scared they were going to get executed. But then something changed. When they saw Jesus come back from the dead, that solidified their belief in everything that he said. Once Christ left and ascended to heaven, they began publicly preaching and spreading the gospel. They were persecuted, they suffered, but they continued to spread the gospel all the way until they were eventually killed, and in John's case, until he passed away. Then you have Paul, a former Pharisee who prosecuted, killed, and hunted down Christians. He was completely changed when he encountered the risen Christ on the road to Damascus. He became one of the strongest advocates for Christianity and spreading the gospel. In all of these individuals, something clearly changed them, and that was their encounter with Jesus. Now, if you look at it from a historical perspective, why would a bunch of disciples who were clearly scared for their life suddenly transform and then start to spread the gospel fearlessly, even when they were being persecuted? The evidence shows that they all encountered a man called Jesus, and after his death and resurrection, they were all tasked with spreading the gospel and the good news. Again, multiple different accounts pointing back to the same man. Next, we look at archaeology. It confirms the world that Jesus lived in. Pontius Pilate was confirmed and verified through inscription. Crucifixion is historically documented as a measure that the Romans frequently used, and the locations that Jesus visited and the customs of that era and time accurately match historical records. The settings and the practices in the Gospels align with general history. The next brief bit of evidence for the existence of Jesus is if you compare Jesus to other ancient historical figures, then the evidence is quite striking. Take Socrates, for example. We rely entirely on his students' writings to confirm that he was a real person, or even Julius Caesar, or even Alexander the Great, all well documented, but they have far fewer sources that confirm that they were real. Yet no one questions whether these people existed. They take it as fact. Jesus has more sources confirming him than all of these people, yet some still question his existence. Now, the next set of evidence is mystical in nature, but I think it's worth mentioning just to give you the full picture, so here we go. Let's look at the Shroud of Turin. Now, many believe that this was the cloth that was used to bury Jesus. The cloth bears a faint image of a man who appears to have been crucified, showing wounds consistent with Roman execution. One unusual feature is how the image is formed. It isn't painted in a typical way. There are no clear brush strokes, and the image sits on the very surface of the fibers on the cloth. It also contains depth information, meaning the image can be converted into a three-dimensional representation of a human. Some researchers believe it was caused by an intense burst of energy or light, which, let's be honest, that's quite mind-boggling when you think about it in the context of Jesus and who he was. Other researchers, such as the ones that examined the cloth in 1988, believe it was a fake created in the medieval period, thousands of years after Jesus' death. However, critics argue that the part of the cloth that these researchers examined was a piece that was used to patch up the cloth due to damage during the medieval period. A more recent investigation from Italian researchers used a new X-ray image technique to demonstrate that the Shroud of Turin dates back to the time of Jesus. This one's still up in the air, but answer me this. How on earth did that image get there during that period, or even the medieval period, with the limited or non-existent technology at the time? And why can't we recreate this exact image or other images on a cloth using our advanced technology of the modern era? It's a mystery, and one that still boggles everyone to this very day. If the cloth is true, well, it just adds even more evidence confirming the gospel and everything Jesus went through. Our next piece of evidence for the existence of Jesus is the modern encounters that many have with Jesus to this very day. People from different cultures and backgrounds report personal encounters with Jesus. This can happen through dreams, visions, or just mystical encounters. Now, admittedly, these accounts aren't considered historical evidence in the academic sense for the existence of Jesus, but they're widespread enough across the globe and so frequent that we should take notice. Some may argue that Jesus is still proving his existence to this very day. The last bit of evidence that I'd like to leave you with is the topic of near-death experiences. Some individuals who are clinically dead report seeing a figure who they identify as Jesus. These individuals come from different religious backgrounds, different cultures. Some have no religion at all and are just atheists, and some are even blind, but they all report the same thing: seeing Jesus. They interact with him, they experience his warmth and love, some encounter a life review, etc. Now, these experiences have been studied, and like the previous point, they're so consistent worldwide that you should take note of them. But as you can see, the evidence for the existence of Jesus is quite overwhelming. So if you ever have any doubts, feel free to watch this video again and share it with anyone who you think could benefit from this type of information. For more breakdowns and evidence-based Bible knowledge, check out our other videos. I'll speak to you in the next one. Peace.